Number 50, Beasts of No Nation. Netflix has made itself a force to be reckoned with in the area of original content, with multiple Emmy Award-winning television series, and now they're expanding their horizons by producing feature films, the biggest thus far being this film, which is no small feat given the involvement of Golden Globe winner Idris Elba and True Detective director Cary Fukunaga. This movie certainly promised a great deal of prestige with its shocking and controversial subject, following the life of a child soldier in sub-Saharan Africa. Ultimately, I think it lives up to most of the hype. The atrocities committed on screen paint a horrifyingly realistic picture of the cruelty humanity is capable of when free will is stripped away by fear and circumstance, but the film never goes so far as to say that these children were fated to become instruments of war. Though the characters may lose sight of it, they're still human and not simply beasts born to serve a singular purpose. There's hope in every scene, though it's often disguised. There is some visual flair and a few stereotypical cinematic moments, but close-ups and handheld long takes give a sense of urgency and realism. There's been considerable buzz surrounding Idris Elba's performance, but the performance that stood out to me is the leading role played by newcomer Abraham Atta. Asked to portray innocence in the face of absolute horror, Atta not only provides a conduit for the audience to experience this world, but finds layers of the character and gradually peels them back. It's one of the hardest films to watch I've seen this year, and some may find it too much to take, but I believe that this film is not essential, it's at the very least important. Number 49, Victor Frankenstein. There's no shortage of Frankenstein adaptations in the world, some of them good, many of them bad, all of them a significant departure from the source material, which isn't necessarily a bad thing since Mary Shelley's original novel is largely a metaphorical tale about the dangers of man's hubris, which wouldn't make for a very engaging cinematic experience at all. But that is something that cannot be said about Victor Frankenstein. This film chooses to focus on the creator instead of the monster and tells the story from the perspective of Igor, not as a lowly servant, but as a friend. So in that regard, it most closely resembles Mel Brooks' Send-Up Young Frankenstein, which it even references in a few scenes. Some may find this film's restructuring of the established story into an action-adventure a bit curious, and this criticism has merit, in that the action scenes are not always well staged and can be somewhat unpleasant to watch. But the motivations and the methods of the titular characters are what is really truly on display here. The ghoulish means by which the monster is created are presented in all their gory details to add an air of discomfort to the proceedings. But the best part of this movie comes from the performance of James McAvoy. Daniel Radcliffe does some good work here, but McAvoy just steals the show every time he's on screen, fully committing to the idea of a mad scientist and making sure everyone knows that he's more than a little unhinged. McAvoy's intense and eccentric behavior provides most of the film's humor and a significant portion of its heart. It's just a joy to watch. This may not be for all fans of monster movies, but if a little madness is your style, definitely check this one out. Number 48, Miss You Already. A cancer diagnosis is one of the most terrifying things that can happen to a person and their loved ones. I've had more than my fair share of family members affected by cancer, and as such, I'm more inclined to be moved by such stories when they're well told, because I remember going through those moments of uncertainty. So I found a lot to identify with in this film. Not so much the wild behavior of the protagonist, but the use of humor as a means of coping feels like something straight from my own life. Now, personal feelings aside, objectively speaking, this is a great depiction of the way illness can throw a life into chaos. It can be difficult to maintain relationships in the face of so much fear, but this film shows the importance of those relationships and support systems. Many of the uglier aspects of cancer are given attention, such as the struggle for married couples, which is handled brilliantly through a wordless sequence that results in the film's lowest point. The value of friendships in general takes a fair amount of the runtime and is given a great deal of respect through showing it to the audience rather than telling them constantly that these characters are friends. This film does suffer from a bit of obnoxious cinematography with lots of unnecessary shaky cam and some pointless Dutch angles, but the script is solid and the acting is excellent. Drew Barrymore does her best work in years, and Toni Collette is magnificent as the deeply flawed Millie, having a midlife crisis in the middle of battling cancer. Some may be put off by the troubled lives the characters lead, but there is a very sweet story of dealing with devastating circumstances underneath all of the dirt. Number 47, Spectre. The James Bond franchise is one of the most beloved institutions in cinema. With 24 films already and no plans to stop anytime in the near future, 007 all but demands our attention anytime he graces the screen. And since the beginning of the Daniel Craig era, the films have been so much fun that watching feels more like a joy than an obligation. Especially the last outing, Skyfall. Director Sam Mendes dug deep into Bond's personal life and found an emotional resonance unmatched by any previous entry. Plus, the tense action sequences made all the more impressive by Roger Deakins' Oscar-nominated cinematography. So the bar was set pretty high for this film. So how is it? Well, while I don't think it quite matches its predecessor, it's still a thoroughly enjoyable movie. Opening on a very impressive tracking shot through Mexico City's Day of the Dead festivities, the tone is set early, as we know instantly that grit and ambition are going to rule this outing. The plot does feel a bit thin, as it's basically a reworking of Skyfall's subplot involving government interference in the 00 program. Even the introduction of the villain is similarly cinematic and imposing, but the villain is where this film distinguishes itself as a spectacle to behold. Christoph Waltz was born to play this part, and every time he's on screen, the whole experience is elevated, even when he's just sitting menacingly, shrouded in shadows. The rest of the acting is strong, with Andrew Scott adding some devious energy to the dialogue-heavy scenes, Ben Whishaw bringing levity and depth to his role as Q, and Lea Seydoux earning her place with the best of the Bond girls. A flawed but satisfying movie for fans of 007, or spy flicks in general. Number 46, Testament of Youth. This may come as a shock to some of you, but war is bad. Countless books and movies have been created with the sole intention of informing people who haven't experienced war firsthand of the horrors involved, and it turns out that it's really bad. Like, seriously bad. Like, however bad you're thinking right now, worse than that. Okay, all joking aside, this isn't exactly a new idea. It's easy to indict wars, Hollywood has proven multiple times a year for nearly a century, but it takes a really creative approach to shed new light on the subject. I think this film succeeds in that way by only showing the aftermath and collateral damage of war instead of the act itself. The devastation, both physical and emotional, is driven home by developing intimacy with the three men going off to fight and focusing it through the perspective of a woman who cares deeply for all of them. The helplessness and anxiety felt by the soldiers' loved ones is deftly portrayed mostly through visuals, and dialogue is spared only for the highest of emotion. The script is well adapted from the memoir of the same name. It is well served by a talented cast. Taron Egerton continues to impress in only his second major film role. Kit Harington does Oscar-worthy work in what ultimately amounts to very little screen time, and the hits just keep rolling for Alicia Vikander, who gives an astounding performance that's maybe only her third best of the year. Thoroughly heartbreaking, but rewarding viewing. Number 45, The Visit. If anyone was going to breathe new life into the found footage horror genre, I would never have guessed that it would be M. Night Shyamalan. With one of the more believable setups for why the characters are filming nearly every moment of their lives, this movie doesn't waste that opportunity by trying to scare us from the start, or waiting too long to introduce the scares and boring the audience for the first half. Instead, it goes the exact opposite direction. Comedy. Real, honest-to-goodness comedy that has you laughing with the characters instead of at them, like it's been in Shyamalan's previous films. We get to know our protagonists gradually and in a very natural way, and they're surprisingly well-rounded characters. Some early scares are revealed to be misunderstandings due to their point of view, which makes the found footage format a brilliant tool because it allows the audience to share that point of view and also keeps us in the dark about things the characters don't know either. We learn things exactly at the same time as they do, and it only adds to the terror. Now, as with any Shyamalan movie, there is a twist, but it's completely earned and well established, which is a relief because it does look like it's going to veer off into extreme M. Night nonsense for a brief moment. Now, there are some predictable developments and the occasional ridiculous scene, but most of these actually pay off in the end. It's an effectively scary film and hopefully a sign of good things to come for a director that I thought was beyond redemption. A must-see for horror fans. Number 44, Pawn Sacrifice. How do you make two people sitting at a table moving little wooden blocks exciting and engaging? Exactly like this. Centered around chess prodigy Bobby Fischer's rise to prominence and eventual descent into insanity, the film picks apart the type of mind required to master one of the most complex challenges disguised as a game ever devised. Fischer's battle with paranoid schizophrenia that was fueled by anti-Semitic conspiracy theories is made as much of an opponent as the Soviet chess masters on the other side of the board. Coupled with the difficulty of maintaining a high level of intellectual success that many prodigies face in adulthood, Fischer's feats are made all the more impressive and difficult to watch because even though he's obsessed and being driven to madness by his obsession, we can see that he would be lost without it. The movie shows the ugly side of mental illness and doesn't simplistically vilify a person who could have been made out to be a monster, but is instead presented as a product of his illness and the refusal to receive treatment. The film is well paced and perfectly edited, making something as mundane as moving a single piece of spectacle to behold. Tobey Maguire is ideally cast and delivers in all aspects of his performance, and the supporting cast is excellent, particularly Peter Sarsgaard, Michael Stuhlbarg, and Liev Schreiber. Chess fans should definitely see it, and everyone else should learn a thing or two about chess and then see it. Number 43, Phoenix. So I talk a lot about originality in my reviews. I'm quick to point out similarities between films, and when I feel something is relying on established formula too heavily, I'll usually say something. But these aren't always bad things. Case in point, Phoenix. There are so many films about the Holocaust, and it's not really surprising. One of the darkest times in human history is sure to inspire a lot of emotion and create passionate responses to that emotion. And when it comes to formula, borrowing from the master himself, Alfred Hitchcock, would seem about as formulaic as it gets. So the fact that this film managed to break new ground at the intersection of the two is just astounding. Loved ones presumed dead, reconstructed faces, mistaken identities, and inheritance to be claimed. This has been done before, but not against the backdrop of the Reconstruction following World War II, and it's a perfect setting as resentment, betrayal, and suspicion fills the air. But this movie knows its limits and doesn't try to speak for the masses. It's a story of two people told through nuance and suggestion. What little we're told through dialogue only paints half the picture, and the rest is up to the actors who come through brilliantly. Nina Hoss is mesmerizing as a survivor of a concentration camp, trying to regain a life that no longer exists and become a person she can never be again. The tension builds for the entire runtime and explodes with emotion in the heart-stopping final scene that may be the most simply staged climax of the year. Accept the subtitles into your heart and let yourself be floored by this movie. Number 42, The Man from U.N.C.L.E. Cold War era Europe, Soviet and American spies being forced to work together, directed by Guy Ritchie, co-starring Alicia Vikander, count me in. I've never seen the show that this is based on, but what's not to love? The time period lends itself to a really great aesthetic that's reminiscent of classic Bond, which is well handled by the set decorators and costume designers here. The strange bedfellow scenario creates a lot of great comedy, largely due to the performances of Henry Cavill and Armie Hammer, who are both charming and charismatic in very different ways. These actors have been hampered by the plotting scripts of Man of Steel and The Lone Ranger, respectively, so they both seem like they relish the opportunity to stretch their legs comedically. And the aforementioned Ms. Vikander is game as well and clearly enjoying herself. The same could be said of Elizabeth Debicki, who's just deliciously evil and deviously seductive. The film benefits greatly from Guy Ritchie's fast-paced style and pitch-black sense of humor. The opening sequence featuring an attempt to escape East Berlin and a later torture scene that takes a hilariously dark turn are among some of the year's best. Some of the action scenes near the end feel a bit underwhelming given their stellar predecessors, but this is still well worth your time. Give it a watch. Number 41, Far from the Madding Crowd. I don't have a lot to say about this one. It's no wonder why it's such a well-made and well-executed film. Based on a literary classic that surprisingly hasn't been adapted and readapted to death, it's at least a story I haven't seen on film yet. And with the abundance of talent behind the camera and some great work being done on camera, this is an easy movie to like. Now that said, it's a period drama, so it may not have a wide-ranging appeal, but those who are interested in this type of story should find plenty of entertainment in this film. A great deal of this movie works because of the confident and nuanced performance by Carey Mulligan. Played as too much of either a cold, unfeeling business person or a playful, silly debutante, the character falls apart and the audience's interest along with it. And Michael Sheen is excellent as the socially inept but well-intentioned William Boldwood. This is pretty standard fare as far as this type of film is concerned, with the exception of some breathtaking cinematography. Some angles, techniques, and lighting schemes that I've never seen before are taken full advantage of here, which I love to see in these kinds of films because there's a preconceived notion about how period films like this are going to look, so it's nice to see those notions challenged. Like I said, not for everyone, but if this piqued your interest, you likely won't be disappointed.